All right, thank you. Again, we record just sort of the presentation part, but not any discussion afterward. And so again, here's our agenda for today. I'm going to have a quick recap of the drought declaration, what that means for the state of Washington. I know many folks here have heard that, but in case we have other folks joining us and for the recording, I'm going to go over that briefly again. I'm going to mix things up for folks' schedules and have Chris go first with the Yakima project, and then jump into Karen and introducing Guillaume with the Office of the Washington State Climatologist, and Nick from USGS on stream flow and groundwater, and then Matt from NRCS on mountain conditions, and of course, Amy, the Northwest River Forecast Center for water supply forecasts. And then we welcome discussion from other folks on different concerns and conditions that people are seeing across this state at this point in summer. So again, WASDC plays an important role for ecology and for the state to be discussing and looking at different current and forecasted water supply conditions. And then at times earlier in the year, we may be leading up to a drought declaration, looking at that hydrologic threshold for drought of being less than 75% of water supply. And here again today, we're looking at different information and assessing our water supply conditions. And as our quick recap, back in April, Ecology did declare drought essentially statewide, with limited exceptions for the metro areas around Everett, Seattle, and Tacoma, as those areas had actively managed for drought early in the season and primarily have large reservoirs to help with their water supply storage. And that drought declaration comes from two requirements here in state statute: that we've met that hydrologic threshold I just mentioned of less than 75% of water supply, as well as a hardship threshold that water users and the environment are expected to experience undue hardship. And in terms of that declaration back in April, I just want to highlight there are a number of different factors that go into that question around water supply. There's not one factor that we look at, and those factors include snowpack, precipitation, temperature impacts on water supply and on soil moisture, soils impacts on how precipitation impacts water supply, as well as all of those forecasted pieces. This is just a quick note to see that even where things came out of June and the variety of temperatures we've had, so with some really hot weather and some more normal weather, we're still seeing all of these watersheds having less than 75% of normal water supply for some point between April to September, or at this point, August into September, with some watersheds being way below normal. But our presenters will get way more into this as we look at these water supply questions from different angles. I just want to highlight, when we talk about hardship, what does that mean? Predominantly, we think of hardship in terms of three different categories: in-stream flows and impacts for fish and wildlife, for agriculture, impacts for irrigators and livestock, as well as public water systems and domestic uses, primarily impacts on domestic drinking water. And in terms of a drought declaration, as a quick reminder, that means that equips Ecology with two abilities: one, to expedite our processing of emergency water transfer applications and drought permits. But again, I always want to note that all of the existing mitigation and other water transfer application requirements are still in place. The only difference is Ecology can do that processing in 15 days now. And then second, as many folks know, we can then establish a drought response grant program to address the hardships that water users may be facing due to these current drought conditions. And again, that is focused on addressing hardships that are caused by these drought conditions, and there will be a benefit coming from the hardships that folks are experiencing from these current drought conditions. And those grants are available to these list of public entities here, including tribes, cities, counties, irrigation, conservation, and different utilities, as well as we're then able to go into interagency agreements with state agencies for drought response that they are uniquely able to do from their different work. And that includes Department of Health, State Conservation Commission, and Department of Fish and Wildlife. This is just a quick screen grab of our drought response page, and I'll put these links into the chat before we close out the meeting today. And with that, so I know some folks have different schedules today, and for the sake of time, I'm going to go over to our first presenter, Chris Lynch, the Borough of Reclamation. And Chris, did you want us to screen share for you? No. Oh. No, you're here, Chris. I saw you come. There we go. Chris, you should be able to unmute. I've also clicked ask to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Ah, yes, there we go. Excellent.
Okay. All right, thank you. I'm going to let you share the screen. And okay, so you can go on to the first slide. That is a picture of Ketulus at the end of last year. Okay, now we're looking at the weather station at the Yakima Airport. It gives us an idea how the weather has come at us this year. So the top half is the temperature, and the bottom half is precipitation. First, let's look at the precipitation. You can see that the brighter green is when we are below average precipitation. So the bright green where it meets the olive green is how much precipitation we've had. So we've gotten 6.09 inches at the airport. That's 82% of average. You can see that's, we haven't had much precip since early April. The upper graph shows the temperatures. July, we sort of, oh, that's too bad. I thought I had updated this one. I thought I had updated this for July's temperatures, but they aren't on there. So I'm going to go ahead to the next slide. Okay. This shows the precipitation at the 5 reservoirs. And we accumulate those and just show the sum. So it looks like a large number, but it's because we're summing 5 different rain gauges. The total for the water year through the 1st of July was 180.9 inches, 85% of average roughly. And we did have a nice amount of precipitation in June, 160% of average almost. But we were below average for the prior 3 months, March, April, and May. And those are high producers. So, of course, that left us in a deficit. I think when you took those 3 months together, it was like 56% of average for the period. That was one of the lowest on record. And that sort of set us up for this this drought that was uncertain until that point. Okay, next slide. This slide shows I'm sorry, I think you skipped two slides. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so this is the inflow to our 5 reservoirs. Again, we sum the total of the 5 together and call it the system and track it that way. We've been doing it that way for years. So the black line is the average. The green line is this year, 2024, starting in the water. So this is the water year. So it starts in October, goes through the end of October on this graph. And we are, of course, below average. For the water year, we've been about 78% of average. And lately, we've been closer to 65% of average or so. Next slide. And this is looking at the Yakima River near Parker. It's a similar look just farther downstream with more of the basin shown, and you can see how much below average we are right now, about 60%. So not so good for the basin. But for the water year, it's been 74% of average. Next slide. Our diversions, of course, because we are prorated this year, the junior water rights holders, which make up a little more than 50% of the diversions in the basin, have been prorated. In other words, their entitlement is curtailed to currently 50% of their entitlement. We got as low as 47%, but have been able to refine the forecast as we've seen June develop. And we did do a mid-month, a July mid-month, to update that, and we're at 50% currently for the pro-rationing rate. So that explains why this is quite a bit below the average, which is the black line. You can also see how when we got into July, with the added heat, the diversions did jump significantly. But that is somewhat normal for the diversions to jump in July, both from the climate and the demands that occur and the entitlements that the districts have. Next slide. Okay, this is the scene at our reservoirs. Average is the black line. Typically, the preponderance of the years do fill, so the average actually skews the maximum downward, but most years we fill. This year we maxed out significantly below full pool, and it was 70. It was about, I think we got up to 78% of average at one point, and now we're at 74% of average on the 1st of July. Currently, we're 5th lowest in the period of record, back to 1971. I look back to 1971. That will put us on track to end up with very low storage at the end of the water supply season, which ends around October 20th. Our reservoirs will end up about where they were last year at the end of the season, because we had a drought year, and our objective is to be able to supply the water as best we can, and that means using up pretty much all the storage that we have. Next slide. Okay, here I'm showing the pro-rationing rates from last year, 2023, across the first row. And you can see the monthly, so you have March, April, May, June, and then we did a mid-June and a July 1st, and then a mid-July. We'll do an August and September forecast as well. I'm showing you where we were last year, and then you can compare that to this year. Of course, we're worse off this year. And you can see how we estimated 72% pro-rationing in March. It dropped to 63%, and then 54%. We got as low as 47% on the 1st of June. And then it crept up, and we've sort of refined it to 50% as of mid-July. And that covers the period May 21 through September 30th. Next slide. Yeah, so to recap, the reservoir storage is fifth lowest since 1971. July has been very hot and dry. Sorry that I didn't have that on the slide for the Yakima Airport, but we seem to have turned the corner from relatively comfortable temperatures in June to very hot in July. Lots of days above 100 for a high. Rationing is currently 50%. We'll update that on August 1st. Sorry, another typo. It should say August 1st. That's next Thursday, not tomorrow, but the following Thursday. And we expect very low reservoir storage at the end of the season. We are at our lowest tier for our target flows at Parker for the summer. Right now, the target flow is 332. We adjust it each month based on some conservation water that we've acquired and some state trust water, etc. And then we will be going into the fall with setting spawning flows and incubation flows at the lowest tier as well. Those will be the same as where we set them last year. So yes, it's been a challenge as well to for the fisheries with the very low flows. Of course, the temperatures have been hot, so I think the fish aren't moving anyway right now, but we did have to use so we had some conservation water that we had sort of stored up from last year, and we used that for pulse flows in the spring. And then we used up ahead of time the conservation water that could be acquired through this season. So we did end up providing some fairly good pulse flows in April and May and early June. But yeah, it was a bit of a stressful spring for trying to provide pulse flows for out migration. And that's it.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Chris. I know you have to run to the big Clay Ellen Fish Passions event, but if you have time for one quick question
yeah.
Great, thank you. So the question I just got in chat is about about the factors that led to not being able to fill the reservoirs.
I'm sorry, one of your words washed out and I didn't quite get the question.
Sure. And Guillaume, if you want to ask your question, you're welcome to just unmute.
Sure, thanks. I think it's a pretty simple question, but I wanted to just double check. Late winter precip was pretty near normal. I'm guessing that the reason that it was hard to fill the reservoirs was because in spring, as you noted, there was low precip, but I wanted to double check.
Right. Our snowpack was below average, for one thing, and we didn't get any big events in the wintertime. So as you saw, our cumulative runoff for the season was about 74% of average. So the combination of no real good refill events in the wintertime, very, very low carryover from last year, and low snowpack. The combination, yeah, all stacked us against refill.
Okay.
So it wasn't just one thing. It was a combination.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate your time before a big day for the borough, and drive safe over to Clay Ellen.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try to listen in on the meeting as I move forward here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Karen with the Office of the Washington State Climatologist. And I just want to note that, like all of our partners, they are a great partner, and I'm very excited for Karen to be introducing our new state climatologist. Heather, if you want to go ahead with Karen's slides, that'd be great.
Oops, sorry about that, y'all.
Cool. Thank you.
Wait just a second. Can y'all see
right.
those?
You can see it. You're going into a presentation mode. Great.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, yeah, hi, I'm Karen. Glad to talk to you all again today. And it was kind of fun to have Chris go first this time, shake it up a little bit. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So I first wanted to introduce Guillaume. I think we've mentioned on this meeting already that we have a new state climatologist. So go ahead, Guillaume, if you just want to say a few words.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Hi, everybody. I don't want to take a lot of time. I just wanted to come in and introduce myself. I've worked with Karen since I started at UW 15 years ago, and I'm really glad that she and Nick have been such an important part of this group. Karen's going to continue to be the lead and your point person and the expert on this topic, but I wanted to just make sure to show my face, let you all know I'm here and happy to chat at any point if there's anything you all want to be working together on or asking about or anything of that sort. So thanks.
Great. Thanks, Guillaume. Go ahead to the next slide, Heather, please. All right, so jumping right in, we're taking a look at the water year to date. So the maps here are showing through July 20th. So they're slightly mismatched with the stats that we have. But on the left-hand side here, we have our temperatures. With the July temperatures, most of that map is showing slightly above normal temperatures for the water year, between 1 and 2 degrees Fahrenheit. If you look at the numbers just through June, average statewide, it's the 15th warmest on record. So that's going back using the whole 129-year record. But the temperatures are above normal, but in sort of that near normal category through June. I expect once we have the July numbers in, we'll officially be above normal for the water year. Precipitation is on the right-hand side, and it's the percent of normal that we're showing. Some near normal areas there in the white colors, but a majority of the state is in the 70 to 90% of normal bands there, so slightly below normal. If you average it across the whole state, we're at 90% of normal precipitation through June for the water year. And again, expect that to drop slightly with how dry our conditions have been in July. Next slide, please. So I wanted to circle back to May and June because at our last meeting, I presented a long time series of the average May-June temperatures across Washington state. And we did end up on the cooler side on the map there. That's temperatures for May and June around the state, some areas of near normal temperatures, some below normal. And it did turn out that we were not as cold as 2022. But this year did rank cooler than all of the recent years since 2012. So I had mentioned some recent warm May, Junes, and this one was cooler than sort of what we've seen recently aside from 2022. But perhaps more importantly is the lack of precipitation. So Chris already showed what we saw at Yakima Airport recently, really much drier over the last 90 days. And that extended in an area much larger than just the airport. The east slopes of the Cascades there, much below normal for May and June precipitation, near normal to above normal in Western Washington. So those of us on the west side definitely heard some grousing about that. But it overall is beneficial to have that little bit of a relief from what we're seeing now. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to show June alone, just to go over the numbers. Average statewide, the numbers are basically meaningless. Everything cancels each other out. June, near normal temperatures if you look across the whole state, near normal precipitation if you average across the whole state. But of course, the maps tell a completely different story. We saw some warmer than normal temperatures around southwestern Washington to the Puget Sound area, southeastern Washington, some cooler temperatures on the northern parts of the state. Precipitation, we can again see the mismatch between western Washington and eastern Washington, really dry June, less than 50% of normal for a large area. And eastern Washington. And most of the above normal temperature or above normal precipitation for June was from that early June atmospheric river. So it came early in the month, and then the rest of the month shifted to drier conditions. Next slide, please. Looking at July, of course, we all know we've had a complete pattern shift. I had to show the geopotential height anomalies on the bottom left there. So that's just showing an anomalously high heights over our region. That's the standard sort of area where you would expect to see higher pressure than usual to bring us heat in Washington. So we've had much above normal temperatures. If you notice, this is just going the last 15 days, so July 6th through the 20th. You can see the scale on the left-hand side is all the way up to 12 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. So a lot of those dark red colors are somewhere between 9 and 12 degrees above normal for that period. So some really warm temperatures, very, very dry, hardly a drop of precipitation around the state. Some local records, these thresholds may be a little bit arbitrary, but Seattle broke the record for the number of days 80 degrees or above this year. So from the 4th to the 20th, it was above 80 at SeaTac. Spokane records is still going. So yesterday was above 90 there. So they're at 19 days now, which is the record for the consecutive days above 90 in Spokane. And then Chris already mentioned several triple-digit days on the Lower Columbia Basin. So summer is here. Next slide, please. Since our last call, the drought monitor has worsened some. There's D2 or severe drought now in eastern Washington, of course, because it's been so much drier there over the last 90 days. And then the change map there on the right-hand side, you can see what changes were made since about the last time we met. Next slide, please. That seems odd. Might have gone backwards or I messed up my slides. Should be an ocean temperature one coming up. There we go. So this is looking at the sea surface temperature anomalies, and I just wanted to draw your eye to the equatorial Pacific Ocean there, where we're seeing some below normal sea surface temperatures, but it's not La Nina quite yet. It does not look like that typical pattern, but we are seeing some cooling there. There's also some cool temperatures right off our coast due to some upwelling that typically we see this time of year, but there's also that patch of warm water further west into the Pacific Ocean, which could have could help warm our temperatures, especially in Western Washington, if it were to propagate eastward. So we're keeping an eye on that. Next slide, please. So we're still in neutral conditions for the El Nino Southern Oscillation. The El Nino's gone. The onset of La Nina, we're now expecting it later than when I spoke to you all last month. The probabilities there on the left-hand side, those blue bars are the probability that during that season, the La Nina will emerge. Previously, it was looking like it would happen between July and September. Now that probability is higher than neutral conditions for August through October. So it's shifted later. On the right-hand side, those are all the model predictions of what La Nina might look like moving forward into the fall. And the strength of the potential La Nina is also looking to be much less than it currently was. Some of the experts on the forecasting here don't seem to put too much weight in that yet. There's time for the strength of the La Nina to change at this point. But according to those probabilities, there's still about a 1 in 5 chance that La Nina won't show up at all this winter. Still higher chances that it will. And then on top of that, some of the seasonal forecast model output that has come out recently of those big averages of seasonal forecast models are suggesting that early fall might be warmer and drier than they were previously showing about a month or so ago. Still looking like overall we could see wetter conditions in the fall, but it's not quite as large of an anomaly or of a chance as it was a few months ago. So the fact that our La Nina might not develop as soon as we thought is already impacting the forecast for the fall. That, of course, could mean that we're not seeing a very quick start to our fall onset of rain or a lot of snow in the fall. But of course, we're keeping an eye on that and keeping our fingers crossed for La Nina. Next slide, please. So I decided to just show the outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center, the shorter term ones on this call here. So our temperatures have moderated some already this week. This is looking further out sort of next week. So the 8 to 14 day outlook is on the top, and then the 3 to 4 week outlook. So that's looking like early August to mid-August. Still saying overall we should be on the warm side, warmer than normal for summer. Precipitation, though, in the 8 to 14 day, maybe some higher chances of above normal precipitation. So we could break this really dry streak we've been seeing, but then we're going back to a higher probability of drier conditions for early to mid-August. Next slide, please. And then the long-term outlook, so August through October, have backed off some of the probabilities of seeing warm temperatures. So most of the state has equal chances, which just means we're pretty uncertain how temperatures are going to go for that period. And then a sliver of Western Washington, we're seeing above normal chances for wetter than normal conditions. So increased chances that we could see some wet conditions starting that 3-month period. Next slide, please. And I believe this is my last. So just to summarize, through June, the water year ranked as the 15th warmest and the 50th driest on record, with slightly above normal temperatures and slightly below normal precipitation. May to June was cool, but we've seen a long stretch of hot weather and dry weather since July. The drier than normal conditions east of the Cascade Crest has been really consistent over the last 90 days or so. The rest of summer doesn't appear to be as anomalous as the last few weeks were. We are seeing those sort of near normal conditions expected for August through October. And La Nina is still likely, but the chances of the development has shifted to later in the summer and early fall. And it doesn't appear to be quite as strong as some of the early models were showing. And that's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that, Karen. Yeah, and I appreciate your highlighting those sort of changes in the probabilities and certainty questions around that transition from neutral to La Nina and the potential impacts for fall rains and what fall may or may not look like. Do folks have any quick questions for Karen before we transition to Nick with USGS? Okay, Nick, you should be able to share your screen. And
right.
for your,
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. I have my video on, but for some reason it's not showing. So at least you can hear me. Great. See if I can find that share button. I don't seem to see it. But oh, I
Should be down at the bottom.
Okay, I see it. I see more. I don't see any other.
If you want,
If you have the slides, you can just show the PDF. Yeah.
I have those
Yeah.
slides. Yeah.
okay, yeah, and Heather, I sent you the newest one right at the beginning of the meeting. Great. Does that look right, Nick?
Great. Yep, that's it. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, just given as normal the update here on stream flow and groundwater conditions. That's Thunder Creek. I was out at Diablo last week on some leave. That was nice, but there, yeah, fire started kind of the day before we left. A little smoky, but all right, you can go ahead and go to the next one. And just, yeah, a reminder that some of the data that we present could be preliminary, always subject to change. And we'll just start here with the 7-day average stream flow like we usually do at all of our gauges in the state. Got kind of a smattering, a little bit of everything, mostly below normal to much below normal. Some of the bright reds there being record lows for the 7-day average at that gauge at this time of year. You know, the sites that we have that are normal tend to be on the western side of the state, as we might expect. Do note that around the Olympic Peninsula, a number of all those gauges surrounding the peninsula around it are much below average. Something just to kind of to indicate. I did also want to let everyone know that we've got a while, but WaterWatch, which I usually use to generate a lot of these figures, is and some of you might go to for resources, is going to be discontinued, scheduled for 2026. A lot of those features are migrating over to the National Water Dashboard. And so at some point, I'll probably show you a kind of a demo of how to get to some of that stuff. Next slide, please. And we'll look at these 8 index gauges that we normally look at that are near natural stream flow conditions. If you advance to the next slide, please, it'll just update with the status of those gauges. So these index gauges basically showing largely what we saw on that other map, that most of these gauges are below normal, with the exception on either end on the west, much below normal at Quinault, and on normal conditions on the Chehalis. Okay, go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. And we'll look a little at this data a bit differently, putting in the context the same 7-day average. You can see that we had, you know, that atmospheric river that Karen mentioned at the beginning of June kind of brought us back up into a peak of normal conditions. The black line there being this year's observations, all the colors being the statistical percentiles. So that had kind of, that June event brought us up into the green, the normal, but since then we've been dropping down through below normal and now are skating on the edge of below normal and much below normal conditions for all of the gauges in the state. Going to advance to the next slide, please. And so then backing out a little further, then comparing that 7-day average spatially on the left and looking at the last 28 days. So July with a little bit of the end of June shows that it was a little not as dry, I guess, in that longer time span. Still having those very dry conditions up on the Upper Columbia and Roosevelt Lake basins. Go ahead and advance to the next slide. I think we'll step out a bit further on the last 45 days. This slide that we normally show on the left here with the vertical axis being the percentage of stream gauges. And I'm showing time here, clicking through June and then much of July. I normally have a line there. Sorry, it's not there now. Right at the 50% of stream gauges, just to indicate, you know, where half of our gauges are. If you go up to when I pulled this data yesterday, and including the 22nd, we're at below normal at least half of our gauges. As of right now, some of them being much below normal. If you look down at the bottom there, you can see that bright red or record lows for the 7-day average in this period. And then similar data, just looking at it a different way on that plot on the right, average stream flow index, just showing us that we were kind of above normal at the beginning of June there. And since we've dropped down and had a little up and we're back down again. So below normal conditions is the take-home message here. Go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. And now looking, backing up further at the water year, looking at the cumulative runoff that is 2023 on the left, 2024 on the right, just for comparison. We were kind of entered into the summer with some better conditions this year than we did last year. That black line being the observed cumulative runoff, and these colors being similar to the other ones where blue is the highest observed, and then that yellow orange being the lowest observed, and that green being that 25th to 75th percentile. So we are still within that kind of normal range for cumulative runoff, kind of going, straying toward the lower side at this point. Go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. And now we'll just kind of take a step back to think of, how we got here. I didn't join you all last month in June, and showed, I think, maybe the April one and some of the May last time I was here. But yeah, we had a relatively dry stream flow conditions in April, and then in May was quite dry with a large number of our sites being much below normal. And then advance to the next slide, please, and it'll take us closer to where we are now, looking at June. And so June on the left is currently this year. So yeah, reflecting these drier conditions, and largely in the central part of the state. Some of the west had some above normal stream flow conditions that were likely resulting from some of that, that atmospheric river event early in the month. I compare that to last June, where it looks quite a bit better than we were last June anyway, as far as stream flow. It's not to say, anything about the snowpack and other factors involved. Go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. And then we can take a step back even further to look at other years of drought and compare June, because that was a full complete month here that we were able to look at, compared to these other drought years. It's as far as stream flow goes, so far in June, it was a bit not as bad as some of these major drought years, as you can see. But we do have that similar trend of dry stream conditions in the central part of the state that occurred with all of these other drought years. Go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. And now we can look at this. We looked at this duration hydrograph before for this year, but this is just comparing it to last year. So that black line being current conditions on the plot on the right for 2024. We hit up in May, and then June. Oh, I'm not sure. Oh, I'm looking at it and it's not showing us going all the way to July right now, but you see the bump right there. I might not have updated it. The next slide will have something, but that bump was that kind of early rain in the summer. But that was decent, similar conditions to 2023, as we'll see in the next slide. Go ahead to the next slide, please. We can look at other drought years that show. Oh yeah, I wonder if that data I think it maybe hadn't got processed all the way for June in there. But that bump kind of in May to June is common. These are these other drought years where we might see stream flow conditions start to drop below normal and much below normal. We did have a significantly higher stream flow conditions earlier in the year and through the winter compared to many of these other drought years. So not sure that was enough yet for the storage that we need, but go ahead and advance to the next slide. I think we might jump, to groundwater wells now. These are the 3 reference groundwater wells we typically look at. I did want to let you all know that 3 groundwater monitoring wells that we have been operating have been discontinued due to the lack of funding. It's the 3 wells on the western part of the state, and this includes Scatter Creek Well, which we normally look at. So we, well, next time we probably won't have that one to be looking at. But there's also, this can be the case with stream gauges too. I could always share a link if you're interested to a site where you can look at endangered stream gauges that are at risk of being discontinued and ones that have been saved. Yeah, this happens with these wells because these are nationally funded wells, and some of that national funding has been pulled back. Go ahead and advance to the next slide, please, and we'll look at the status of those. So Scatter Creek in the west there, typically, as of the last couple of years, has been running at normal conditions throughout most of the year. That's where we are right now. Look at Davenport, that is below normal conditions. The one in the middle there, the red dots being the observations for this year, those colors being those percentiles. And then on the right, the Whetstone well down by Walla Walla, good just below a normal conditions there. If you can go ahead and advance to the next slide, please, and we'll look at one of the plots for Scatter Creek well. So this one, again, just being really responsive on an annual scale of recharge and discharge as we kind of came up a bit higher than last year. Both of those kind of recharge peaks being truncated and are kind of on our way back down. Again, go ahead and advance to the next slide, please, and we'll look at the Davenport well. This one I've zoomed out to a much longer time frame, back to 2016, where we saw lower groundwater conditions, and we had a big kind of recharge for a number of years, and before we came back down in 2022, 2023 water year, and kind of had a little second recharge event since then. So it'll be interesting to see if that keeps kind of on a longer term trend going up as that last period was. Go ahead and advance to the next slide, please, and we'll look at the Whetstone well. This one has a lot more less systematic recharge in this well, and not so dynamic. So looking back though, just to 2021, we're kind of back down from that small recharge that occurred earlier in the year, and yeah, on its way down. Go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. I think it'll just be a summary. Yep. So 7-day average stream flow conditions at the index wells, most of them being below normal, with normal conditions at Chehalis and much below normal conditions on the Quinault River. Cumulative runoff is at about normal, and the monthly average groundwater conditions being normal at Scatter Creek and below normal at Davenport and Whetstone. And with that, that's all I've got, and can take any questions if you have them.
Great. Thank you, Nick. Any quick questions for Nick before we move to Matt for mountain conditions? Great. Thank you, Nick. And of course, we will have time for any other questions that come up in our discussion time. Matt, I will pass it over to you.
There we go. Sounds good. Thank you. Go ahead and share my screen. All right here. There we go. And you all can see my screen, correct?
Yep.
Cool. All right, so today I'll just be touching on precipitation and soil moisture conditions. Starting off first with precipitation across our SNOTEL network. And as has already been noted across the state, and this has been pretty consistent this year, that statewide water year-to-date precipitation is below normal. Last meeting, water year-to-date precipitation was 88%, and as of today, it is 89%, so fairly similar, and at that 38th percentile over the normal period. And the only region of the state, again, pretty consistent over the course of this year, that is near normal in terms of water year-to-date precipitation, is in the Mount St. Helens region and with a few sites north and east of there too that are near normal. But for the most part, water year-to-date precipitation at SNOTEL sites in Washington is below normal. Now looking at today and monthly precipitation. First, looking at the map on the right, showing June precipitation across the state. June was a fairly wet month compared to normal for many sites across the Cascades and drier as we go east of the crest. But again, looking closer to the Idaho border in northeastern Washington, there are a few sites that are near to above normal, notably just northeast of Spokane there at the Ragged Mountain and Quartz SNOTEL sites. Month to date so far in June, precipitation has been quite poor in the mountains, with most of our sites registering amounts that are well below normal. But again, this is the drier season, so any miss by a few tenths of an inch is going to swing that percent in a pretty extreme direction for the most part. But it is notable that precipitation so far has been quite poor this month. Now, I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at the 84-day precipitation. So this goes back to May 1st to now, or July 23rd, I guess, end of day precipitation values, looking at the percent of normal period precipitation across the Cascades during this period, notably west of the crest, has been fairly near normal. And of course, as we go east again, we're seeing lower or below normal precipitation at SNOTEL sites, with the exception of a handful of sites in northeastern Washington and the Touchy SNOTEL site in southeastern Washington. Olympic Peninsula during this period seeing precipitation amounts that are below normal as well. Now taking a look at soil moisture conditions, again with the disclaimer as we scroll through some of the site data that this is just point data. Also, I'll show some modeled and satellite-based soil moisture products towards the end here. First, taking a look though at a Bucking Horse SNOTEL site on the Olympic Peninsula. This is the chart or the plot on the upper left. Soil moisture conditions, a little bit spotty. We've been having some issues with the telemetry at that site. But soil moisture conditions there are moderately below normal. And as we move to just northwest of Mount Rainier at the Burton Mountain SNOTEL site, soil moisture conditions are below normal. It's been fairly below normal for much of the winter and through the summer so far. Moving up north in the northern Cascades at Beaver Pass SNOTEL site, soil moisture there continues to be extremely poor and setting new period of record lows. And then at the Rainy Pass SNOTEL site just southeast of the Beaver Pass, soil moisture conditions there again continuing to be quite poor through June and now through July and are well below normal. Moving on to another batch of sites, looking more in eastern Washington. First at Salmon Meadows in the Upper Columbia Basin. Soil moisture conditions there have been fairly decent throughout much of the water year so far, and is trending more, well, right now, above normal. And then taking a look at Moses Mountain SNOTEL site, soil moisture there is below normal. Now taking a look near Spokane or the Washington-Idaho border at the Ragged Mountain SNOTEL site. Soil moisture there was fairly normal throughout most of winter and spring, and since the start of July has been rapidly declining at a higher rate than normal and is now trending below normal. And we're seeing a similar rapid decline in soil moisture content in at the Sourdough Gulch SNOTEL site in the Northern Blues in southeastern Washington. Both stations are showing an extreme, I would say, drying trend over the last month. And now comparing some of that point data with model and satellite-based products, I think for the most part, there's general agreement between these products that there are dry soil moisture conditions, very notably dry conditions in much of southeastern Washington. And another area where these products are consistent are portions of the Northern Cascades in Washington, where there's pretty pervasive drier soil moisture conditions. And some agreement, at least between the Topofire and Sport Lease, that there's drier soil moisture conditions across much of the Olympic Peninsula, and generally a little bit less agreement in a lot of other areas across the state, with the exception of the Yakima Basin, all products showing fairly dry soil moisture conditions, as well as parts of the Eastern Cascades as we move north of the Upper Yakima. And just to, so our last forecasting period, of course, was June 1st, but I want to give a pretty quick comparison between the observed stream flow over the past 3 months to the June 1, April through September forecast, just to see how they compare despite the two being different periods. Both are showing percentile, and we can see for the June 1, April through September forecast, so that includes some of the observed data during that forecasting period. We can see, a really poor outlook beyond June 1 and through summer across the state. And if we take a look at that 3-month observed stream flow, that's matching up pretty well with what was being forecasted. So I think the forecast for this year for the summer outlook will align fairly well with the observed stream flow as we look back in the fall. And that is all I have.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Any quick questions for Matt before we wrap up with Amy on water supply forecast? I'm not seeing any immediate physical or virtual raised hands, but I will check again when we get into discussion time. And Amy, you are now welcome to screen share. We're happy to screen share for you.
We'll see if I can get this up and running.
Okay, no pressure.
Is that working?
Yeah, I see it loading. Yes.
You
Beautiful.
figured it out. I need some tips from you, Amy.
We'll see. I don't know. It's inconsistent for me, but worked this time, so I'll take it. So our water supply contact is on there if you have any questions. I'd also like to give a shout out to Brent Bauer at Seattle, Robin Fox at Spokane, and George Perry is also in attendance, the service hydrologist from Pendleton. So I need to get his name on these slides too. So just covering again what other folks have already covered in great detail. We just show things on a larger scale. Precipitation has, dried up since the beginning of June. So we had these couple of atmospheric rivers come through, increasing the June precipitation in the western half of the state. But really after those initial spring events, we really haven't had much precipitation in the region since. So we see very hot and dry months second half of June and for all of July so far. Likewise, these temperature maps show some cooler temperatures in the western portion of the state for beginning of June, and then warmed up from there for that hot July. Looking at the runoff map on the left-hand side, I'm showing the runoff as a percent of normal since the beginning of the water year, which begins October 1st. So this is, roughly 9 months of runoff that we're showing here. So a longer time scale than what Nick was showing for sure. But similar patterns. So we're seeing these oranges and yellows indicating below normal amounts of runoff. These greens are closer to normal, and a lot of those basins are the lower elevation rain-driven basins, since we did have that really poor snowpack this year in most regions of the state. The right-hand side is showing, the map there is showing the April through September forecast. So we're now, almost 4 months into this 6-month period, showing a very similar story, below normal forecasts for this period in these river points. And I would say as I updated these maps from last month to this month, I didn't see big changes. And that's bad news because these are very low forecasts, but the good news is they didn't really get worse in the last month. I was a little bit fearful that they would have. I think the reason why they've held steady is we didn't have a big warm up during the snowmelt period. Most of the snowmelt was gone already by the time we got that really warm July, or I guess we're still in a pretty warm July. So again, I'm showing the same forecasts on the left-hand map, with just expressing these as a percent of normal. Again, this is the April through September period, but on the right-hand side, I've ranked these in descending order. So these deep red colors here and these single digits are, anything below 10 or 5, I always say is flirting with a record low. But these single digits are really, within the lowest to 10 to 5 on record. So really quite bad in a lot of the state. This is the most depressing thing I'll show today. I've been saying that all spring. Moving on to what we expect in the next 10 days in terms of precipitation, because this is incorporated into our models, our ESP10 forecasts. Left-hand side is showing the straight up inches of precipitation expected to fall in the next 10 days. So a little bit here in Washington. This middle map is expressing those same numbers as a percent of normal. So you can see that despite the fact that there's a little bit of precipitation expected to fall, it is lower than normal in the next 10 days. And the same story for that far right-hand map, that's percent of normal. At this point, really, the soils are dry, as Matt just went over. Precipitation that we see coming into the basin is generally not causing a pulse in the river. Most of it doesn't make it to the river. It would take really intense precipitation over a smaller basin to see a rise. So you might see that in smaller streams, but generally the rivers that we forecast are too big to be accepting rain pulses this time of year. So I didn't show a table this month comparing last month's runoff to this month's, just because there wasn't really a change in terms of percent of normal. But we did see a little bit of changes with the April through September forecast. So this table on the left is just showing key water supply forecast points around the state. And this gray column is showing the percent of normal expected for the April through September period. Again, we're 4 months into this, 4-ish months into this observed period. This right-hand column is showing the changes since, that's not supposed to say May 1st or May 21st. That's supposed to be June 24th, which is when we last met, I believe. Apologies. But we're seeing some decreases here on the western portion of the state. So the biggest one here is the Dungeness near Sequim that I will call out. Our forecast there, our April through September forecast, decreased by 8% since last we talked. And that is largely owing to the fact that I tore out some of the modeled SWE from that basin, snow water equivalents. We had simply over simulated our snowpack during the spring runoff period. And I could see that the runoff was not coming out like that modeled SWE would predict. So I took that down and that decreased the forecast there. Otherwise, the changes in forecasts are pretty minimal. 2 to 4% is nothing that I would balk at in terms of fluctuating forecasts. Looking at some of the forecasts on a monthly timescale, just because we are 4 months into that 6-month April through September period, I would definitely point folks towards these if you have a forecast that you watch closely. So these blue bars are the observed volume for each of these months. I compare that to these green diamonds, which are the 30-year normal. The 30-year average at this point is pulled from 91 to 2010. Did I say that right? 91 to 2020. So these yellow box and whisker plots are the current forecast as of yesterday. And so you can see July here is expected. This little squished box and whisker plot is well below this green diamond here in the Skagit. So you can see that we are predicting a large deficit here, and in the majority of our west facing, really all of our forecasts at this point, are predicting a large runoff deficit accruing in July. And you can see that that has been the case really since the spring. We did have a few months back here in the winter when we reached normal runoff, but we're not expecting that for the rest of the water year. Same story here in the Dungeness. Again, this is that point that I took out some snow because I think some modeled snow. I think we were over simulating snow there, unfortunately. So you will note that these July and August forecasts have dropped since we last talked. The Chehalis is a less snow-driven basin, more rain-driven, but still lower than normal forecasts there. But pretty close to normal at this point. The forecast is going a lot on average rainfall. We don't have that snowpack in the basin to use as a predictor. And just looking at the key water supply points on the east side, again, big deficits, blue bars not making it to green diamonds, deficits continuing to be forecast for the remaining months in the water year, but especially in July, which is kind of the last remnants of the snowpack are usually coming out now, and we're just having less of that this year. So my two major takeaways from today are that runoff and water supply forecasts remain lower than normal. If they haven't changed a lot since last month, I take that to be somewhat good news. But overall, the April through September water supply forecasts are near record low in many places. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Great. Thank you for that, Amy. I appreciate all of the comparisons about sort of where we are now and where we came from. Any questions for Amy? I don't see any virtual or physical raised hands. So Heather, if you want to stop the recording here, we'll open up for any sort of discussion or other questions or comments